Hello, I'm Loyd Auerbach, and welcome back to Busting Ghosts in the 90s, a 5-part seminar series teaching you to be a paranormal investigator. I'm sitting here at the Moss Beach Distillery, one of my favorite places to come and investigate. I've been coming here a number of years, talking to dozens of witnesses who have had experiences both seeing a ghost, seeing an apparition, and having experiences with physical phenomena. I'd count myself as one of the witnesses as well. It's a great place to investigate, and as you learn to be an investigator, you know how to piece things together about the background story. We'll tie it all together with some information on intuitive skills from a psychic's perspective, that of my co-presenter Annette Martin, so you'll understand how your own perceptions, psychic and otherwise, can play in with all the other skills that one needs. Also, we'll toss in a little bit about the equipment that an investigator might use on these investigations. Altogether, all the skills will help you become a good, solid investigator of the paranormal. Hi, I'm Loyd Auerbach, Annette Martin, and we're back with our Module 2. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the basic techniques of an investigator, where you have to start with and what you really have to know. Now, we're not going to be able to go through everything in this piece because trying to learn some of these techniques takes a little bit of practice, too. Some practice you'll have a little bit later with some of the role-playing. But we'll talk a little bit about interviewing skills, how to get some background, whether it's either from the family that you're involved in or from local history societies or maybe even a little bit online. I want to talk to you a little bit about observation, how to observe, how to be a good observer. And in this part, I'll talk and even demonstrate a little bit of magic. Because as a magician, I've learned that fraud is not what I'm looking for. Misperception is what I'm looking for, how people misperceive things in the environment. The fraud piece of this is so small, so minimal, when you're dealing with haunting cases or apparition cases or poltergeist cases, that it's really the misperceptions you have to look for. And understanding some of the psychology of magic helps you with that. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. We'll let Annette talk quite a bit about intuitive skills and how you can help develop some of those. And then we're going to finish up talking about equipment, because everybody wants to know what's the technology that you should take with you all the time, and then what's the technology that we know we can't afford, that you might want to take with you. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, now in terms of interviewing, one of the best things that you can learn how to do is how to ask questions. Because asking the right question, sometimes at the right time, is very, very, very important. In your information packets, there is actually a list of questions that I've included actually from my book, ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists. It's a very extensive list that I really pulled from a few other sources, such as William Roll's book, The Poltergeist, and from some other parapsychologists, so I had a lot of input into that list. And the idea is that there are questions probably to cover almost every situation. I say almost every situation because I didn't think of everything. There's no way to think of everything, really. Sometimes you have to think on your feet quite a bit. But the questions that are in there, which will help you later with the role plays also, are things you want to take a look at. Kind of who do you ask and what do you ask is really important. But the thing is, you've got to ask. At the same time, you have to be a good listener. So part of this process is being a good observer, a good listener, and watching and listening to how people actually respond to questions. Most people think that you go out on a case, you sit down, you just can start the interviewing process at that point. But really, the interviewing process starts with the phone call, if that's the point you're starting with. Now, I'll give you a typical scenario. Somebody calls up our Office of Paranormal Investigations. I'll call them back. And the first thing out of 9 out of 10 people's mouths is something like, "You're probably not going to believe me," or "I'm sure you've never heard this before." Now, my response usually is, "You know who you're speaking to?" We call the Office of Paranormal Investigations. So yeah, I've heard it before. And
no, I get the same kind of questions.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. People think that they're so happy to find somebody they can talk to,
right?
That they're so used to saying, "You're not going to believe me," or "You're going to think this is weird."
Or you're going to think I'm crazy.
Yeah, so that's always the first thing out of their mouths. And
always.
Sometimes, unfortunately, they are things that we can't believe and that are a little bit weird because they really don't fall into or fit into these things. And sometimes there are psychological disturbances that have to be addressed. And that's the other piece of this. I usually ask people to tell me their story right up front. Now, when you listen to a story, sometimes you have to kind of go with your gut instinct or with your intuition
Yes.
to determine that. But it's important to listen to what they're saying and how they're describing it. And it's okay as you're listening to their story, and it's really important to do this, that you do one of two things. Either jot down keywords for yourself so that when they're finished telling their story, you can go back over that story very clearly, very easily, or you stop them and you ask them questions. But make sure that things are clear even the first time you hear it. Then you have them go through it perhaps a second time after you've asked these questions, just kind of summarize it again. But it's really also important to find out things like who else is involved, when was the last incident that happened is probably a really important thing. And also, what do you think it is? Because that's going to determine why they're even calling you. People are often calling because they're afraid, they're in need of help. And I think that the majority of people who have these experiences probably have positive or neutral experiences. But here's the problem. Think about this. You never call a cop to tell him you had a good day. You certainly wouldn't call a cop to say, I wasn't robbed today. The police, fire departments, people in emergency rooms, they hear about bad things that happen because you don't need help if you don't feel afraid, or if you don't feel hurt, if you don't feel like you need assistance.
One of the things that I've always felt is that people are very confused and they don't know what is happening, what is going on. Am I losing my mind? That's one of the questions that they'll ask me, Annette. Maybe I'm losing my mind. I'm not sure, but I want to talk to you about this since you're a psychic and you've had experiences like this before, I'm sure. So tell me, am I crazy or is this real?
People want validation for their experience.
Absolutely.
They want to know that other people have had these experiences. They want to know that they're not crazy. And the problem is that sometimes their family members think they're crazy.
Oh, yes, they do. That's very true.
And sometimes they're right, but most of the time I think if they've gone to the point where they've said, I wonder if I am crazy, they're probably not. If they're questioning things to that extent, there's less of a likelihood that there's a severe psychological disturbance behind it. Now, there's still an issue of perception. Have they perceived an accurate or real situation? Or have they fooled themselves? But the likelihood of there being a severe psychological trauma or something else that's consistently disturbing them in all aspects of their lives, if they're questioning that point, is less likely. Not impossible, but less likely.
It does happen, though, because I do have a lot of people who call me and they are mentally disturbed. And what I will do is I will tune into them on the telephone and be able to pick up whether they are or not. And after asking them a few questions, well, how many times has this happened and how do you feel? And are you on any particular kind of medication right at this time? Have you had any emotional experiences that are devastating to you? Have you lost someone recently? Questions like that. And I will be able to get a feel almost immediately that, aha, there's something else going on here. We don't have a ghost, we have something else going on. So then what I will do is I will ask them to come into my office for a reading.
And I'll do something different. And I have to say that it's a little bit harder sometimes for me to ask those kinds of questions. You're on medication, have you had any traumas recently? Because I'm not a psychic.
Right.
And so they're not willing to spill their guts to me.
Right.
Necessarily. In that situation, even the fact that I'm asking if they're on any medication may indicate to somebody who doesn't know me that I'm questioning whether or not they have a real experience. So I have to be really careful up front to couch things in a way or get them to trust me a little bit on the phone first before that can happen. So I really have to give them back some information, and that information may be after I've heard their experience, here's what it might be, here's a range of possibilities, providing some of the information that I provided in the first module of today. Here's the kinds of things that people report. And that gives them at least an understanding that I'm willing to believe this type of experience. Now, the other questions I might ask, and I get asked all the time when I ask them, are you on medication? It's like, why do you want to know? And the answer is, because this could be affecting your perceptions, or it could even be jogging your psychic ability.
Right.
Because medication can, in fact, cause you to be a little bit more psychic, more open.
Yes.
And even saying something like that might be enough to make them open up further, and generally is. But not always.
Yeah. Well, just a little sideline here, which is so interesting. I've worked with a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists, and I did a whole summer of dealing with this one particular psychiatrist's patients. And when the patient knew that I was going to be there with the psychiatrist, they never spoke to the psychiatrist. They only spoke to me. It was very, very interesting. They wanted to know my input immediately. What did I think? What was going on? So what I learned from that was that people are so open to a person who is a psychic. And someone I'm a psychic counselor.
And you're
so
willing to actually give an answer to somebody where
Yes.
people know that in psychiatry and psychology very often they don't get an answer.
That's true.
Right away.
That's true.
Especially the more we see on TV. Unless you call Fraser Crane, I guess. Radio psychiatrists give answers immediately.
All the time.
Saves you a lot of money that way, too. Asking questions at the front, one of the other things you've got to really know up front is, and this is to me a really crucial piece, is something really happening now? I get a number of my calls are things that happened maybe last week or the week before, and my next statement to them might be, has anything happened in the last day or two? If not, it may be kind of over. So I tend to wait a little bit before. I may not go out immediately that day unless there's a crisis of things flying around as they're calling, and I'm hoping that things are going to continue till I get there, which is unlikely. But
you hope.
I hope. I really hope. And I'm sure they hope too, in that case,
Right.
even if they are afraid. But you've got to really allow for currentness of the situation to happen. Because, again, if something happened, if somebody saw a ghost or had a perception of an impression, as Annette talked about last week, the ghost might have shown up once, might not still be there. Even
Right.
if they think the ghost is there, if they had a visual experience or an auditory experience, I want to know that they've had another one of those more recently to the time they're actually calling me. Because it's important to know that something's really still there. Now, ghosts are people too. They're dead people.
Yes.
But they're volitional. They've got
Yes.
intent. If they want to go someplace else, they can go someplace else. And I'm not talking about necessarily up there or down there. I'm talking about to the house next door. Or to a store, to a movie. So there has to be some sort of connection to know that there's something, again, to investigate. Otherwise, it's kind of like a prowler was at my house last week. What's the response to that? Let me know if he comes back.
Did he take anything?
Yeah, did he take anything? What's the effect? We're dealing with a different situation. Now,
Yes.
if there's a way for me to determine that this was an impression people had, because this has happened every month, I'll try to get them to figure out whether there's a pattern there. And then we'll try to come as close to when that pattern reoccurs. But at least in that situation, we have a chance of somewhat validating that we're likely to get something on the magnetic field detector, or at least gather information enough to say what to look for the next piece of the pattern.
Well, also in knowing that the ghost is there, or if it is an impression, because an impression is there, it's there, okay? And so if someone has tuned into this impression, if they go back again, sure enough, they're going to see it again, most
Right.
likely. Okay.
And it's also a better chance that myself and people on my team will pick up something in an impression situation, rather than if there's a ghost kind of coming in and hanging around.
Yeah.
Especially if the ghost is deciding that we shouldn't see him or her in those conditions. Listening is really important, because a lot of times what you're going to hear are some other additional pieces. And here's where it starts getting into the psychological realm. It's very good. I grew up in a media family. I'm a TV baby. I mean, I watched everything from Twilight Zone and One Step Beyond before I could probably ride a bicycle. So and that actually got me into parapsychology, which says a lot, I guess. The thing about a lot of my colleagues in parapsychology is a lot of them are not aware of the popular culture. And there's a real problem when you're trying, and it's fine if you're in the laboratory, but if you're trying to deal with people on a day-to-day basis, you actually need to be aware of even the tabloids. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say buy them all, because I don't certainly buy them. Once in a while I'll buy the Weekly World News, because it's a lot of fun to read.
I mean, you don't buy the Inquirer?
No, but I read it at the newsstand.
Oh, okay. When you're buying your groceries.
That's right, exactly. It's important to know what's out there. It's important to be aware
Yes.
of that stuff, because
Yes.
a lot of times I'll hear descriptions of things that clearly I can pin back to a movie or a TV show,
Yes.
okay, or sometimes to a tabloid headline that I happened to have seen two days before. And then when we go into situations, we sometimes, it actually helps to be snoopy. Look at what's on their shelves, take a look at the videotapes they actually have. I walked into one case years ago where literally we walk in and we saw two things that were really impressionable to us. I mean, it made an impression on myself and my co-investigator at the time. One was that there was, the woman was Catholic, and there were crucifixes all over the place. I mean, literally all over the place. Statues of saints and things like that, which, you need to know people's religious background, because their interpretation will often be from a religious perspective. You need to know their cultural background, because you're going to get a bit of that in these pieces also. And you have to be real careful how you treat people in those situations, because you don't want to insult their background at all, but you also may know that what's really happening may not be the religious interpretation. So it's important to kind of divorce yourself from that. The other thing we saw as we walked in, which was, to me, I still even remember the headline on the top issue, a stack of the Weekly World News and a smaller stack of the Star. And the headline that was on the top issue of the Weekly World News was one actually I had purchased because it was so funny. Famed psychic's head explodes in ESP experiment.
Oh, no!
Now, the funny thing was, you open the issue and find the article. It was a review of the movie Scanners.
Oh.
Which is, to me, I'm surprised they didn't write it up as a real story, because the Weekly World News does that. But it was actually a review. But it's things like that. And when I looked down and picked up the first issue, and of course the woman and her mother, who she was living with, kind of looked at each other and looked at us and said, "Oh, we think that's a really funny publication." And then I'm looking around the place and seeing all the crucifixes, and I'm thinking, you told me that there's somebody choking you that's invisible, and okay, we have to consider what you're reading. When
Right.
we look at this for the interpretation.
Yep.
So you need to know things like that. Sometimes you can hear that on the phone, because people will throw things, especially the religious perspective. Common report to me is part of this, they go through this whole process of telling me some really good information about a potential apparition case. And they're telling me, next thing they say is, I'm being possessed. Okay, now, possession, which of course is 9/10 of the law, in most states, involves a spirit coming in and taking you over. Not a spirit coming to your house and trying to take your house over. That's different.
Right.
And so there's a different interpretation. If you can tell me that your head's been spinning around and you've been levitating off the bed, that's different. But people will often misinterpret because sometimes of what they hear somewhat. And it's interesting enough, it's usually not the real devout Catholics who will say this. Because the real devout Catholics will have gone to their priest and had a discussion with the priest, who will then tell them what's really going on and say it's an apparition, it's a poltergeist, because most priests are very savvy in this area.
Oh, yes, extremely. Yeah. Extremely, yes.
So it's
Being raised
interesting.
in Catholicism, I can speak about that.
I think people in lapsed religions are sometimes, because they don't know enough, sometimes actually are the ones who fall into the popular cultural mode. And that's what we're usually getting. See,
One of the things about possession, so many people do call me as well and feel that they've been possessed. And as far as I'm concerned, I have never seen anyone who was possessed. And there are a lot of people out there making money off of people who feel, and the therapist will tell them that they are possessed. And I've been brought in on several cases, and I just blatantly tell the therapist and the patient, I do not see you as being possessed. There may be a ghost in here and out of here, and you may have some, right, exactly. And you may be a little paranoid at this time, or a little skittish, but you are not possessed. That ghost has not come into your body and taken you over. I have never seen that happen.
if we look at that as the idea of even channeling, where a channeler opens themselves up,
Exactly.
and somebody comes in, and you have a different personality speaking through there
Yes.
at that point. So unless the ghost who is speaking through the person says, "Hi, I'm possessing Loyd,
Right.
and I'm not going to leave."
Right. And I do channeling all the time.
Right.
I don't like to even use the word channeling. I don't like that word. I don't like metaphysical words anyway. And it's like they are communicating with me as a psychic, as a human being. And so I am able to take on their persona for a very short period of time, but then they leave. As soon as we're finished with this, and I use my white light, which I'll talk to you about later, and they're gone. They leave. They have not possessed me. And I think that that's very, very important for people to know and to understand. And you, as an investigator going out there, you need to be very cognizant of that fact, to not let people feel that, oh gosh, maybe this ghost is going to come in and take me over.
In some respects, even if you feel that it might really be possession, you should be real careful about how you even label it that. And one of the things that we have to try to consider is our ethical considerations here. When we go into a place, if we were to come into a place like this building, and investigate it for a haunting if there are witnesses, it's different, or a restaurant. That's different than in a person's home, or an office setting even, where people are disturbed or afraid or scared, and there are psychological ramifications of everything that you say. I even, in cases where people are not even afraid, I often suggest that perhaps they talk to a counselor at some level, just to go through the emotional rebound
Absolutely.
of that. So it's really important that sometimes you may not even want to tell. It's kind of like a doctor being afraid to tell somebody they have a terminal illness in some respects. You've got to be real careful in how you couch that. But in most cases, you can kind of go past it by making it clinical. In other words, by giving them information. And in some respects, an investigator is as much a teacher as an investigator. Giving people a good background on what the types of phenomena are, the experiences people have, and I give out sometimes as much as I take in, if sometimes more. That helps bring it down from a fear plane, because the more they know, the less afraid they are. Even if they know that they should be afraid. You can kind of detach yourself from the fear at that point. It's the unknown that scares people more than anything else.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely the unknown. And again, my experiences with ghosts are, they are not evil, and they are not going to harm you. And that's what people need to understand.
And asking a question on the phone saying, like, you've seen this apparition, you're afraid, do you think the ghost is evil? And they'll often say, well, either I never thought about it, or, well, I'm afraid the ghost is going to hurt me. Do you think most people are evil? Ghosts are people, aren't they? You know, you try to create a logical connection between these things. Here's another thing that's kind of interesting. You know, asking people simple questions. Right after the '89 earthquake we had, within 3 weeks, and of course it was Halloween time, which made it doubly incredible in some respects, but I had a lot of phone calls about people who said, in San Francisco, people claiming that things were moving around their house. Now, what's the first thought you have? Aftershocks. Okay. Now, what if I said to you, as somebody who was calling in to me, to Loyd, it wasn't during an aftershock. I know the times of the aftershock. They're in the paper. It wasn't during that time. The next thing I said to them, and this doesn't always occur, is, okay, you're in a city that has now had a lot of roads trashed. Construction equipment's moving through the city, often heavy trucks. Okay. Anybody been in some of those Victorians with heavy, very heavy trucks? What happens to the home? Shakes. So I said, have you thought about looking out the window next time something like this happens? And the answer was generally no, because they're focused on the phenomena and they're not hearing the outside sounds. This is that whole observational process, the subliminal perception. So if you can ask questions to say, okay, now what else was going on, not with you necessarily, what else was happening outside in the home? The first thing that happened in a case in Florida, that we had a psychic talking to a ghost. We had all of our equipment going off. And on the tape later, videotape later on a playback, we actually heard screams in the tape. Now, in that case, what's interesting is nobody heard the screams inside the house. This was at 3 o'clock in the morning, but every once in a while we were going outside to make sure that there was nobody in the area. Because I want to make sure that nobody, if we heard any sounds in the place, we want to make sure nobody was actually throwing things at the house or anything like that. So you have to kind of listen for or look for other explanations anyway. As it happened, we were able to consider that there couldn't have been anybody outside, because in fact we even had people outside at the time who didn't hear the screams outside. So you have to kind of look for other explanations all the time with this. The questions that I've given everybody, the list of questions that's in the packets there, covers kind of the who, what, when, where, and how. So you got to know the basic things. It's kind of like what an investigative reporter or police investigator will do. You have to know about the phenomena. And sometimes, you know, asking questions like something you said recently when we were doing an interview. You said you never see a ghost's feet.
Right, right. Absolutely incredible.
But with the impressions, you'll often get an impression of a whole person.
Yes. Yes.
And that's really interesting when you think about it. If you picture yourself, get a picture of yourself in your head for a moment. Now, I've already said feet, so you probably have the feet in there, but most of the time when we think of ourselves, we think of ourselves from maybe the thighs up. Rarely, usually from the waist up. So when if a ghost were to appear to somebody, usually what we think is going on is people are picking up the impression that the ghost has of themselves. Why do you think ghosts have clothing? You think they go to a department store? They are generating that clothing from their own mental impression of themselves.
Right, their memory.
Their memory.
Their memory.
So if they think of themselves clothed, which most people do, they will appear that way. I've had cases where the ghost has appeared in different clothing every day. Because people change their clothes every single day. But these impressions, they don't change their clothing.
No,
they're not thinking.
no.
It's just a full picture.
Yeah, they stay the same.
That's right.
They stay the same. So the second time we went back to the Brookdale Lodge, what was it, a week and a half ago, guess what? They were all dressed the same. And I just giggled to myself and I thought, isn't this fun? They all look the same. So I knew for sure. Yes. Oh, yes. In the same position.
In the impressions, when you go into some of these places, when people say they see something, that's repetitive, you can learn that. It typically is the same position at the same times of day. Now, you might actually find that 3 hours later, those same people you saw over here are now over here, if that's the other piece of the haunting. So it really can depend, but you can typically discern a pattern, an actual pattern. Now, that doesn't also mean that ghosts won't appear at certain times. Typically, the Blue Lady appears in the mornings when there are workmen or people working in the kitchen to play around with them.
Yes.
Or at least she affects things at that point. And she'll come around for certain dinner hours, and then apparently late at night if people stay overnight, because we did that a couple times. I've talked to people who've stayed overnight, and it's only when people are around. Now, that's interesting because if nobody's around, there's nobody to report it. So she could be doing all sorts of things, and in fact, we find some evidence that she has from time to time.
She has, yes.
But you know, people talk about things that go bump in the night, and it's really they go bump any time of day or night. It's that if you don't have a witness, how do you know that something happened?
You don't know.
Right. In talking about the interviewing, part of what you're doing is getting a background also on the people, on the location. And one of the things that happens with a ghost case is two pieces. With an apparition case, you've got to find out who that ghost was. Sometimes you can't by just inference. I mean, you have somebody appearing here. Let's say there's just a guy in a business suit appeared right here. Now, we have no way of knowing who that is unless we do what? Well, how about asking him?
You have to ask him who he is.
I mean, the thing that people never do with apparition cases, because unless you watch comedies, which is about the only place this ever happens, you never ask the ghost a question. You usually run the other direction. And that's what one of the things we try to get people to do is if you involve the people themselves in the case, there's nothing to be afraid of. Get past the fear. They can become one of your best sources of information from the ghost.
Absolutely.
You're not always fortunate enough to bring somebody like Annette in the case. So you want to get people who are actually seeing the apparition, get them to be your intermediary because they're seeing the apparition.
Right. And obviously the apparition is there because they are there as well. And so the apparition ghost feels comfortable with those people.
To show himself or herself to them.
Exactly. And so it makes logical sense to have those people ask the ghost, you know, well, who are you and what year did you live in and do you know that where you are and what is happening? And see if you can create a rapport. What will happen then, what we have found out, is that then the person who's living in the house or the hotel or the restaurant will begin to feel more at ease with the ghost and actually begin to strike up quite a relationship with the ghost.
That's right. People often are very comfortable with their ghosts after a while.
Yes.
You can also sometimes infer what's going on. I mean, with the Moss Beach Distillery, the first people who did see her, even back as far as the 30s, would see this woman in a torn, slightly bloody blue dress. Now that would indicate violence of some kind. So when something like that happens, you consider that, okay, it's likely that there's a connection. And most of the time you can usually assume there's a connection between the family, if they're living in a family place, or the building, and they go some connection of some sort. In the case of the Blue Lady, you can then look back at the history and try to see if you can match up that situation. A restaurant I did investigation of with Martin Caden in Florida, a place called Ashley's, we did work with some local historians to try to find out who was this figure. There were two figures that were seen, a little girl, young girl, and a fairly tall man. And the local paper, in fact, one of the reporters had actually seen the ghost, which kind of helped the situation a bit. And he had done some research, and then we talked to some other local historians, and we found out that, in fact, a man fairly matching that description had been killed. This was a restaurant right on the train tracks, like literally butt up against the back train tracks near Cocoa Beach. And a man had been killed right outside the restaurant in the 50s, right on those train tracks. I mean, literally parallel to that. And he matched that description. And then on the highway, A1A, right in front, a little girl had been run over, had been hit by a car as she ran out in the street from the restaurant a few years before that one. And again, the description pretty much matched. So sometimes you'll find some sort of connection in those cases. Doing historical research can help. If you're dealing with a family setting, one of the best therapeutic tools, get them to do the research for you. Okay, A, it saves you time, unless you're really interested in doing that kind of research. But B, it gets them involved in the process. It detaches them somewhat emotionally, but at the same time, it spurs on the curiosity.
Oh yeah, and
the positive emotions.
Relieves the fear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely relieves the fear. And then they know they're not crazy also.
Because they're looking for that connection that they can find.
Definitely.
And also people, I mean, those people have a really good motive to find out as much about the history as possible. Their motivation is to solve the mystery of why they're having the experience.
What else people begin to feel is that they're very special.
I've got a ghost in my house.
Yes.
That's why I'm doing this historical research.
Right.
And fortunately, local historical societies, I think Dina and Kathy, you've probably found this out. When they hear ghosts, they're happy. It's like historical societies and ghosts, even if they don't believe in ghosts, they're just really happy to open their books to you because, you'll probably find out something they didn't know that way. So it's always interesting. Also, if you ever consider going to do research in a newspaper, I actually would suggest going down, if you can, to the paper if they've got a room that you can use for their microfiche. Because if you say to the newspaper librarian, I'm checking on a ghost case, you don't have to say it's yours. If you're telling other people to do it, or you can say you're investigating a case if it is that situation. They're really happy because you know what? They might get a story out of it. And they will actually even do the research for you. So there are some helping pieces here without even having to worry about the online piece of this, which I'll talk about in a moment, which is unfortunately not real good right now. Not yet. It's getting there. But there are places you can go. People, even if they don't believe in this, find it very curious that people are doing historical research around ghosts and poltergeists or local legends, and they are more than happy most of the time to help. I've had people in private libraries even say, oh, really? And just suddenly open up things that they've never opened to anybody else before. Because people are interested.
Fascinated.
It's a little vicarious thrill for them most of the time. Maybe they were always hoping they'd have a ghost. We're hearing more and more about the internet now. And of course, people are going more and more online. And there's more and more information appearing on the internet. But right now, as I'm sure if those of you who've used it, there's a major problem, and that is trying to search on the internet may require doing searches through 250 search engines and going through all these different places. Now, there are a lot of meta search engines that can do things for you. I've done trying to do research on a local area is always a good idea on the internet because you can get a familiarity with what the local people have put online very often, because you can often find that there are just local shops and places like that that decide to give their take at the local history, if it's that kind of situation. But there are plenty of situations right now where you're still really limited. We're going to be limited for a long time to microfiche, to that old Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, to help from reference librarians who really know their stuff, local historical societies. I work also part-time for an online information company where we have one of the largest databases in the world, LexisNexis. And we don't go back very far. Earliest publication, full text we have of a news-type information, case law, legal cases go back all the way. But in terms of information, it's in the mid-'70s. And that's partly because, at this point, technology does not allow us to take that microfiche and scan it in a way that we can search it later. Yeah, it can be scanned as pictures, but you can't search the text. That's going to change. So maybe sometime in the next 5 or 10 years, that will definitely change. But at this moment in time, when you do research historically, you are in fact limited to the traditional sources. And the best books I've found that tell you how to do that kind of research are books for writers. And there are a lot of great books on how to do research if you're a writer on just about any subject. They will point you to every association, every organization, and then just making friends with a really good reference librarian at a good public library, if you can find a good one, somebody who really likes doing that sort of stuff, and finding somebody at a local historical society who can teach you how to do historical research is often a good idea as well. But these are kind of pieces that fall in if you're doing certain types of cases, like the impressions cases, hauntings, some apparition cases. Many of them have nothing to do with the historical location whatsoever, and they have more to do with the family themselves. What's their history? A friend of mine did a case where the ghost clearly was the woman's mother. She and her husband and the kids were seeing the ghost, and the ghost was apparently even tucking the kids in at night. They were perfectly happy to have her. She just was not a reliable babysitter. She loved the family. So looking at the family history was really clear to figure out. And I had another case which was interesting where, this is when I was working in New York with the American Society for Psychical Research. I knew the woman who had this ghost, and she was a psychic. She was a really good psychic, but she was seeing this ghost with no face. Her son kept on saying, "Mom, it's Dad." Her husband had died a couple years before. She was apparently just back in the dating scene, and he was popping in to make sure she was okay.
Oh. Checking up on her.
She didn't want to recognize that it was really him. And it was only when I brought in a psychic.
That's called denial.
It is denial, that's right. And it was really kind of funny to see her 14-year-old son kept on saying, it's Dad. I'm telling you, it's Dad. And I finally brought in Alex Tannis, the psychic I was working with. And he walks up and he starts describing it. And he says, you have a picture of your husband? Because this guy is telling me he's your husband. And so when she heard from an outside source, then she accepted that was the case. But that was not a situation where we needed to do any sort of history at all. Interestingly enough, that was a house that was built in the Revolutionary War days and had heavy impressions all over the house. I mean,
Oh my gosh.
you could feel certain places had real interesting vibes.
But she wasn't picking up on that.
Oh, she was picking up on that, but she could differentiate right away.
Okay.
And the fact that the guy with no face had modern clothes and everybody else had Revolutionary era clothes was a big giveaway too.
Yes.
They weren't ghosts. But we were able to track back we did track back who owned the house, and found out a lot of interesting things that matched up with some of the events that we saw and were reported in the impressions.
Yeah, that's the fun part. I like that part too.
And we haven't even talked about poltergeist cases because that's a whole different ballgame. That's where we're dealing with family situations, clearly. And the giveaway is always moving objects, but that can happen in some apparition cases, as we'll talk about later. The key is when you have moving objects and then no figure being seen or presence being felt necessarily, it actually makes sense sometimes to proceed along the lines of, it's a poltergeist case, one of you probably is causing it. Let's see if we can ask you enough personal questions to find out who's stressed out. Because there's always stress involved. So you have to kind of direct your interviewing skills in certain directions based on the story that's being told to you. Keep that in mind later on where the role plays, by the way. We're going to take a break for lunch right now. So, and we're going to come back and talk more about observation skills, let Annette talk about intuitive skills, and that equipment piece. So we're going to actually move our lunch break to a little bit further up since we got a little bit late start. And since lunch is already here, they were actually not supposed to deliver it until about 20 minutes from now, but we don't want it to go bad while it's back there. So, yeah.
In distinguishing, especially when you were talking about seeing your friend at the foot of the bed, and then you're discussing the difference between apparitions and impressions, did you notice a difference of your senses prior to your friend and prior to when you saw the images at the place that you saw last week? And what was the visual difference? I mean, could you see through, was it the same for both circumstances?
No, they are very different. The feeling for the apparition ghost is a one of more like in 3-dimension. Okay, I will see a lot of color. I will get a feeling, an emotion that is coming from that ghost or that apparition. In the imprints, they usually ignore me. They're not paying any attention to me except when I'm doing murder cases. I'll talk about that a little bit later. That is a little different in how that works. But the impressions are more flat. I get kind of a flat feeling. And it doesn't have the same kind of emotional hit. It's quite different.
You know, it's rare to find a ghost tied to a location unless the ghost happens to really like that place, like some of these haunted restaurants. And that's another thing that I like to look for, is that it's a pattern of some kind. Is there a direct tie between the person? But sometimes you find that these people who are hanging around have a psychological connection to that place that they just can't break.
Yes.
They just feel like...
And so the emotion is very high. So the emotion is high. So that's why I'm saying there's more of an emotion attached to the ghost than there is to the impression.
And visually, could you see through both?
Yes, you can. You can kind of see through them. They're not all solid. Sometimes they're a little bit solid, and sometimes I can see through them. But I'm not seeing bones or anything like that. You know, it's kind of hard to describe.
Sometimes they have a bad self-image. We had a case in Concord a few years ago where the ghost was being seen as kind of like an amorphous blob. And based on the impressions from the people there, plus the psychic I was working with, plus a couple other pieces we were able to pick up, this was a guy who just like thought of himself as an amorphous blob. I mean, he had a really low self-esteem, really low self-esteem. And so we had to tell him, you know, you got to like praise this. It's great having a ghost here. Come on down, you know, that kind of thing. Within a couple of weeks, they actually were getting occasional impressions of a figure, a man. And eventually, he just kind of left. I guess he could just only stand so much praise. Or maybe he just liked being, being depressed all the time or something like that.
Many people, when I do my readings, and I will see those who have departed, and we as human beings always think that when we leave and go into the spirit world, that we're all-knowing, that we suddenly know everything.
But as Charles Chart has said, and this is not exactly a quote, dying does not significantly improve your IQ.
Absolutely. Okay. It does not. So if you leave with a low self-esteem, guess what? You have a low self-esteem. So it makes a lot of sense. And what is so interesting to me as being the psychic is that I can then communicate with them on the level that they're on, and get them to talk, and just like I was talking to a regular human being who was alive sitting in the chair. It's fascinating.
That's why they make better sitcoms and horror movies.
Yeah.
From a visual standpoint, I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that an apparition or a ghost does not, and Loyd mentioned something about this a couple minutes ago, that most people perceive themselves as their upper extremities, not including basically their ankles and their feet.
Unless they were shoe salesmen.
Is it the same case in impression? Impressions contain lower extremities? Or
Yes.
that's another way that they could be differentiated then?
Yes, that's very true. In the impressions, I have seen feet because I have seen people dancing with high heel shoes on and high button boot shoes.
There's another piece too, I think you would agree with me on this, is when you look at somebody, you can see that they're looking back.
Yes.
When you look at a photograph, you can't see that they're looking back.
Right, right.
So you get that light behind the eyes, so to speak.
Right, which is the ghost.
Yeah.
And the impression is not. It's more flat.
Yeah.
It's a more flat feeling.
Any other questions before we take our next break? Yes.
We did a place called The Hungry Hunter in Milpitas that a lady told us about. And we got some anomalies on some photos, so we went back to research. Until 18 years ago, it was a cow pasture. Then a restaurant, a two-story restaurant got built that was there for 10, 12, 15 years called the Big Yellow House. Everybody sounds like Milpitas. A great little Italian restaurant. Then for a year it was Nina's, and then for the last 2 or 3 years, it's been Hungry Hunter. Can't find a store. Can't pick up a thread of anything. I went 3 times to the library. The reference library has brought us every book written about Milpitas. So we can't, we're stuck. We don't know.
There may not, the reason things may be happening may be completely dependent on people having maybe one party one night left an impression. Maybe there was a fight one night that didn't make the papers. Maybe there was, and nobody died in the restaurant. Maybe there's somebody visiting that just enjoyed the place when they were customers or worked there and had just felt, this is a place with a lot of people and it's got a lot of life. This is where I want to go. I mean, sometimes that's the problem, is that when you ask all these questions, you're left with nothing. There may not be a historical connection. Or it's a historical connection of a type that is not necessarily going to leave you with a lot of information. I'll give you one quick example before we take our break. It's a case, it's one of my favorite stories to tell, actually, and because it was written up in, of all places, Playgirl magazine. A friend of mine is actually the manager, one of the editors there, and she wrote it up with the title "The Sexorcist." So I can say that I've been in Playgirl at this point. And the story, this was a case I investigated early in my career in parapsychology, and a couple had called me from, I was again working for the American Society for Psychical Research in Manhattan and living in Westchester County, and a couple had called me from northern Westchester and said that they had just moved into this house a few months before. It was part of a fairly new development, 5 years old, and every night, almost, not every night, but almost every night, at around 3 in the morning, they would be awoken by the sounds of a couple making love in the next room. Because there's two master-type bedrooms. And I said, "And this bothered you?" And they said, "Yes." It's just kind of noisy, it's annoying. They weren't really afraid, they just couldn't figure it out. Go in the room, there's nobody there. They never saw anything, they would just hear these sounds coming from this room every once in a while. So went up there, and this is well before I had the technology to do anything with a magnetometer, because I have a feeling it would have registered really high on that scale. The room felt odd to me, not bad. Not
Was it
good.
cold?
It wasn't cold. No, it just felt kind of odd.
Strange.
Just because I was not really good at that kind of impressions yet. But I wanted to talk to the neighbors. I wanted to find out about the history. Nothing had ever happened there. It had been an area of woods, no Indians, no burial grounds, no Revolutionary War massacres, or nothing had happened there. Built this area. Nobody else was reporting anything. And finally, as I'm talking to this next door neighbor, I started asking about the previous tenants who had owned the place. Well, it had been another young couple who had moved into the place when it was first built. The guy next door actually had been there the entire time, so he knew this couple. He said that they were fairly young. They had just gotten married. After the honeymoon, moved into the house a whole bit. He said they were a really nice couple. There's one thing that bothered me. He said, really only noticed during the summer when the windows were open. I said, what's that? Well, usually almost every other night at least, sometimes every night, around 3 o'clock in the morning, you could hear them going at it from that bedroom over there. And that was the bedroom that the couple was hearing things from. I said, so they were loud? He said, yeah. I said, do you know where they are now? Are they dead? He said, no. They were stockbrokers and they moved down to New York. So this is a couple that was alive. They had left an energetic impression behind that had been their bedroom. And historically, the only tie you can have is that there was a witness who actually said that he heard similar sounds physically coming from that room. So people leave impressions behind, positive or negative. How do we get rid of that sort of thing? Well, I'll tell you more about resolutions later, but in that case, I suggested that they do one of a couple things. One, they have a really good party and include that room in their merrymaking, hopefully kind of record over it. Or they could try to record over it by going into that room themselves and making love in there. Which thing do you think they did?
They went in there together.
They actually moved their bedroom into that. They figured that they never had an experience in that room. They might as well just move their bed in that room. They'd never hear the sounds from next door.
Right. That's logical, isn't it?
It worked fine, yeah. As we continue with the whole idea of really dealing with your witnesses and dealing with people, one of the things you want to consider is your observation skills, your ability to kind of perceive what's going on, and that'll help you with understanding other people's observation skills. We talked about about ESP being part of the perceptual process where information processing is going on. And part of the situation here is that in every single case I've been on where there is something really real happening, somebody sees a ghost, somebody has some other sensation of something, maybe an impression or something like that. The problem at that point is that if you are at all really interested in the phenomena, whether it's from a fear base or curiosity base, you're now suddenly sensitized to everything in the environment. You're looking or listening for something to happen, whether you're aware of it or not. So you may have seen that figure kind of walk across your room at one point or be sitting on the couch and then vanish. And suddenly now, every sound that you hear, you're going to wonder, is that a normal sound? Have I heard that before? House settles, somebody upstairs, cat on the roof, anything becomes part and parcel of the of the experience process. Part of the investigative process is to take each and every event that somebody talks to you about and separate them out. Now, people ask me, why do I try to figure out if there's a normal explanation? Why don't I just go in and just deal with it? And the answer is, from a perspective of helping the folks out, yeah, you want to just go in there and deal with it. And that's a good part of it. But if you really want to know what's going on, the only way to know that it's paranormal or psychic is to eliminate all the other possibilities first for each and every event. I don't want to attribute to a ghost, for example, that somebody's seen somebody falling down the stairs, because the people have done that. And I don't want to attribute that to a ghost. I don't want to give somebody a bad rap and say that's a bad person to push you down the stairs. If in fact it's because you saw the ghost, you were at the top of the stairs and you were so freaked out you fell down the stairs, which is what often happens. I've had people report to me that they heard a sound or saw something downstairs and felt they were being pushed down the stairs. Now, unless there's two ghosts there, I don't know too many ghosts who can reach up, 20-foot flight of stairs and tap and push you from behind while they're being seen from below. Unless you talk about a psychokinetic push. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense if somebody wants just to be seen. So things just don't make sense. You have to really take each piece separately. Now, sometimes this will happen because people misunderstand, because they're now suddenly sensitized, and sometimes it'll happen because people try to fake you out. And let's face it, every single profession has its experts and frauds, some of whom are the same people. And you have to take a look at the issue that people talk about phony psychics all the time. Well, they're phony doctors, they're phony dentists, they're phony stockbrokers, they're phony everything, right? And there are some people who just by the nature of their jobs may come across that way. depending on what kind of position you're talking about. So really, you have to look at the issue that there's going to be phonies in every profession. But what can you do about it? And is what you're being given or taken, what it's being taken from you, a good or a bad thing? One of the things I've liked to say is that if we take the idea of, let's just kind of back out here of ghosts for a moment and talk about psychics like Annette. Okay. Annette comes up with specific information. That's important. I have a distant cousin in Canada who is actually a psychic. I met her years after I got into this field. Actually, she hadn't seen my father in a long time. And her definition of a good psychic was somebody who could give names, dates, and places, specific descriptions. She said anybody can give generalizations. And that's true. Anybody can give generalizations. Anybody with some degree of acting ability can convince you that they're psychic, if they're able to do good generalization, and if you're willing to listen. Now, the interesting thing is that if you read any of the Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes stories, and you didn't know Holmes was somebody who was extremely well educated, extremely logical, extremely able, well able to connect disparate pieces of information, if you didn't know that, and one of the stories talks about perhaps him taking the contents of somebody's pocket and telling them what his profession is, and then you don't read the explanation for how he knew that when he tells Watson how he knew that, because Watson thinks he's amazing. That's psychic. But there's very logical considerations for each and every piece of information. So someone who's a really good observer of human nature can come up with very specific information and have a really good logical way of doing it. Now what's interesting is that that kind of observation skill may be as good, if not better, than some psychics who are genuine. And if someone is coming to a psychic for an answer, think about the reasons why people go to see psychics, or psychologists, or bartenders for that matter. They want answers, right? You got a problem, you want an answer. Psychology may, if you got a brief therapist, that's good. Somebody into brief therapy, they can give you an answer really fast or help you. Really, what's going on is they're trying to help you realize what your answer is. When I was bartending years ago, I didn't give anybody any advice, except maybe what to drink, or what not to drink. I told people what they said to me. I kind of fed it back to them, mirrored back to them, and usually found that helped them recognize their own issues and their own answers, because we have our own answers built into us. So a good observer of human behavior can actually get to the heart of the matter faster than a good therapist might be able to. So in some respects, if you get a really good phony psychic, it might be worth the money you're paying. If you get a really good psychic, that's even better, because they're actually able to see a little bit extra beyond that piece. And psychics often are very, very good observers of human behavior also. There's nothing that says that you can't be psychic and be logical, and that you can't merge the two things together. In fact, if your eye sees something, why ignore that just because you need to have it psychically? You can merge these things together. It's all part of the perceptual process, and sometimes it's impossible to separate this stuff out. Now, if you get into the ghost cases, into other things, we have one basic problem, and that is you're not there to observe the piece of people observing the ghost most of the time. You're going on secondhand information. So what we do when we go into the cases, we have to observe the physical surroundings. And it's only in certain poltergeist cases that we can sometimes see a clear physical effect or physical explanation for things. Although sometimes it can be pretty simple. Earlier I mentioned the idea of an earthquake and then trucks rumbling down the road. Well, here's another one. I was talking to a woman on a radio show a few years ago, and at night she said that she would see globes of light floating through the air in her house. And in fact, she's like on the phone to us. She's telling us, I'm seeing one right now. So the host looks at me and says, because the host is a friend of mine, knows a bit about this stuff too. There's a friend of mine named Lee Spiegel, who's the executive producer of a show called The Edge of Reality. It's on radio right now. He said, car? Off radio to me. I said, let me ask you a question. Where's the globe appearing? Because we were talking about this, and it was appearing on a wall, kind of like floating up, looked like it was floating up towards a stairway. And I said, is there a window opposite that, and where do you live? And it turned out that as a couple of cars would go by, and this is in the wintertime, it would reflect off the snow. And when she looked out the window, she could clearly see where that globe of light was coming from. But it wasn't in direct line of sight with a car. It was actually off some of the snow that was bouncing off. So you have to kind of ask what the surroundings are. And when you go into some of these cases, it becomes very obvious, sometimes not on the phone, but very obvious when you're there, what other explanations there might be. All right, so being a good observer of the environment and what else could suggest things to people, have them kind of walk through, recreate for themselves and for you where they were when things happened. Take a look at that. That's important when you're going into cases. Now, magic or mentalism. And mentalism is actually considered by some people a branch of magic. That's that kind of magic, it's usually mental magic, where if you've seen The Amazing Kreskin, he's a good, popular example of that. Someone who pretends or puts out that they can somehow read your mind, do psychic things, and sometimes they don't usually say that. They may not say that at all. Mentalism actually is its own branch of that form of entertainment that we call magic. It's not necessarily a subset of magic. There are some folks out there who would bristle if you call them magicians, who are psychic entertainers, and that's one of the reasons why there is an organization called the Psychic Entertainers Association. But basically it is learning to talk about or do things in a way that may seem or come across or simulate real events. Now, I have to ask you all a question. This is something we get from the skeptics all the time. An argument, the better skeptics don't ever do this, but some skeptics will say, if you can duplicate it, it can't be real, really psychic. Now, if that's the case, then I would have to put to everybody that Hollywood has done a good job of proving that the world doesn't exist. That there are never earthquakes, tidal waves, or anything else, because Hollywood has essentially, literally done the world over and over again with special effects. And that's all magic is special effects in some respects. So that's not a good excuse for saying it's not real. It doesn't work that way. But you can simulate things. But what's interesting is those people who perform out there on stage as mentalists or do some forms of magic often end up having psychic experiences as a result of being on stage pretending to be psychic. I've talked to a number of mentalists who in the middle of their act will get something. They'll actually perceive something. And here's an interesting thing. If you're performing mentalism, ESP does not work 100% of the time. We all know that. So if I'm wrong part of the time, it actually even seems more real than if I'm right all the time. Okay? A magician has got to perform every time. Everything's got to work. Perhaps not so with mentalism. What's interesting is that on occasion, a mentalist performing will get a flash of something in his head, and hey, who cares if I say it and it's wrong? Just add to my credibility, perhaps. But what's interesting is I've talked to a number of people. They'll get a number flashing in their head, some concept, somebody's name, pop it out of their mouths, and suddenly somebody in the audience is going, oh my God, how did you know that? That's my social security number. Or that's so-and-so. So in other words, it relates to reality. And so there's nothing that says that performers who are faking this stuff or pretending to be in a position cannot have true psychic experiences. Unless, of course, they don't believe in this stuff. That's a whole different issue. Now, this is all for entertainment purposes, of course, and there's nothing wrong with this because actors pretend to be somebody else when they're on stage or in a film. Some people, there are some of the debunkers out there actually have talked about going after mentalists and psychic entertainers, which is like going after an actor. Now, if they're a bad actor, that's one thing. Or a bad mentalist, that's one thing. I have to agree with that. But if they're performing and entertaining people, when you go to see a show, you're paying for a show. When you go to see a movie, you're paying for a movie. Hopefully you're paying for a good movie, but we all know that doesn't always work out that way. So you have to consider it as that. Let's do a little bit of psychic or paranormal entertainment right now. And I'm going to require, well, before we do that, let's just do something nice and simple first. Okay. Let me ask everybody a question. Okay. I want you all to think of a card right now. Okay. I'm going to somehow make you all think of the same card. It's the same card on this card right here. Guaranteed. I never miss. I sense somebody's thinking of a joker. I want you to change your mind. Okay, because I've taken the joker out of this whole thing. Batman got him. All right, everybody got it? Good card? Now, I want you all to change your minds. Because I don't want you all to think of the first card you thought of, because that's too easy. Everybody got something? All right, I'm going to show you the card. You tell me, just it should be right here. Everybody see your card? Okay, good. Just want to check. It's called covering all bases. Sometimes you have to be absolutely certain. Okay, one of the things that's kind of interesting about doing, and this is, I'm just going to step aside from the psychic entertainment for a moment and talk about just general magic. Magic often works on perception and misperception. We all hear about misdirection all the time, and people talk about smoke and mirrors and things like that, and most magic tricks don't rely on mirrors. This one does. You can all see the mirror, right? Just kidding. The idea of perception is we tend to learn to see things behave in a certain way. Kids are much harder to fool or entertain with certain forms of sleight of hand, simply because they don't know that something behaves a certain way. They see things as they really are instead of how we think they are, because we have learned to perceive things in a certain pattern and behave certain ways, which is how the psychology behind magic works best, is playing with people's learned perceptions, perceptual expectancies. All right? 3 pieces of rope. All exactly the same color. They're all dirty. All exactly the same thickness, the same length. No difference whatsoever. I'm lying to you. This is an illusion. You're all seeing 3 unequal lengths of rope, right? You're all seeing a long, a short, a medium, and a long piece of rope. That's right. But I'm seeing them as they really are because these are really the same length. I'll prove it to you because you all look skeptical at this point. See, David, if you had the camera on them, they look skeptical. They really look skeptical. Yes, I knew that. Okay. Bring the ends up to the top. We have 2 ropes, 3 ends each. How many ends is that? Right, 2 ropes, 3 ends each. That's 6 ends. 1, think about it, 2, 3. 2 ropes, 3 ends each. Think about it. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3 pieces of rope. Now they're all the same length. They're the same color. They're the same thickness. They're slightly different, but not much. This is an illusion. I'm not really standing here doing this. I'm an apparition. Because if I was really standing here doing this with the 3 pieces of rope, I couldn't show you that those 3 equal lengths of rope are really a short, a medium, and a long-sized piece of rope like that. Thank you all. I will take applause. Now that works off perception. You're perceiving things and expecting to see things in a certain way. There's a perceptual issue there. I'm making use of some manipulative principles, of course, a little bit. But it's really a perceptual issue. It's how you're seeing them and not being able to think outside the way that we normally think. One of the things I've learned in learning magic has been great is you look at the world very differently suddenly if you get into it. You're not seeing things as you thought they were. Sometimes you see past issues. Again, I'm not looking for fraud necessarily unless I go out in a situation where I suspect fraud perhaps, and I've run into people who are basically con artists who are pretending to be psychics. They're not so much phony psychics as they are con artists. They're con artists who do a lot of different types of things. So that helps me a lot there. In the case of the ghost cases, it helps to know that there are principles that are involved in people's perceptions. Sometimes it's not that simple. Sometimes you just can't say, well, it's sleight of hand or something else. So let's do a little something with psychokinesis here with big cards. This will work. Okay, David, I'm going to be moving around a little bit here. So let's have you pick a card. Okay, and I'll turn my back. You can show it to everybody, including the camera. Okay? Now, I'd like to place it right back on top. Now, the way this is going to work is very simple. I'm not going to find the card. No, this is California. The cards have got to find themselves. Actually, what's going to happen is you all, having seen the card, are going to help me with this. Because what we're going to do is ask the cards, this particular card, to reveal itself. And I'm trying to think if we can do this somewhere high up. I'll just do it in my hand here. Concentrate and try to think about seeing that card. Whoa. Come on. So we can kind of help it along. Sometimes vibrating makes things rise.
Who is your writer?
Whoa. Little mind over matter effect. And if you don't mind, it certainly doesn't matter to me. That your card?
Yes.
Okay. Give the cards a big hand here. Now, they're getting old. I have to kind of train them a little better because they're getting slowed down in their old age. All right. I would like someone to come up here and help me a little bit. I do need a volunteer. Let's use this deck of cards here. And I'm going to move this table out a little bit. Anybody notice that card over there? Has it been there the whole time? Okay. Just want to make sure that people noticed it. We'll get rid of this card here. All right, somebody want to come up and help me for a moment? Somebody can. I'm going to have to grab somebody out of the audience otherwise. All right, come on up. Stacy? Deck of cards, Stacy? Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you give them a quick shuffle?
How many times?
You can shuffle them 2 or 3 times, 4 or 5 times, however many times you feel. Whoa. That wasn't a good shovel. That's a little better.
One more time. 3
Okay.
times a charm.
Good. Now I'd like you to make 3, 4, 5 piles, however many you want. Just cut them into a bunch of piles. Okay, I'd like you to cut each of those piles one more time. Just cut them in, you can just give them a quick cut and complete the, yeah, that's fine. We can make separate piles or complete the cut either way. Okay, and we're going to start eliminating things here. I'd like you to go ahead and point at 2 piles. Okay, we're going to get rid of those. I'll pick them up here. All right, now, point at 2 more. Okay, get rid of those. No. Okay, point at 2 more. Those 2. All right, now you got 2 piles left. Do you have a favorite pile there? That's your favorite pile?
My favorite part.
Okay. Take the top card of your favorite pile and look at it. What is it?
Favorite part.
Okay, let me hold this card up. Go ahead and grab that card that's sitting up against the wall. What does it say, Stacy?
8 apart.
See, now she's scared. Okay, let's just I'm going to do one more thing with this. One of the pieces that you often find psychics using are tarot cards. I have an extra card in there, in fact. Tarot cards represent actually the oldest part of the playing card field. The basic minor arcana was transformed in some respects into our deck of playing cards today. And there's also a major arcana, which are the cards we typically think of with death and the devil and other things on it. Now basically, tarot cards are interesting because people imbue more power to them. You know, if a psychic is doing a reading, it's a very interesting thing. And many psychics actually use tarot cards and they'll use crystal balls. And this is typically the stereotype that we think of simply because their customers expect that to happen. Some of the best psychics I know, actually, their customers will not let them do just a straight reading. They actually have to have something in front of them. You know, don't you have a tarot card deck? Okay, I'll use tarot cards. And that's, it's just window dressing in some respects that you're dealing with, which is kind of unfortunate because it's not necessary. Whoa. In the scheme of things. Now, I would like somebody up here to come up here and help me a little bit. So let's have one of the folks that I don't know. Who doesn't mind being on camera a little bit? Would you like to come up? Okay. And I'm going to give you this box. Okay, before we do anything, I want you to cut the cards into 4 piles. They do not have to be equal, though. A little hard on that surface to pick them up, I think. And maybe we can just kind of lean them each time on the edge here, so it'll be a little bit easier. That's good. And I can tell by the way you read, you kind of took those cards and put them in piles. They're fairly equivalent, so you put a lot of thought into it. I sense, and also you were taking your time doing it, so I sense that you have some really good degree of good judgment. Would you say that people think of you having real good strong will?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, because I sense a strength, an inner strength in you, a very strong will in that. I'm also getting that you're a very lucky person. At least right now you're going through a period of luck, or at least I think it just seems like things are happening around you that are dropping in your plate, just kind of dropping into place for you.
That's true.
And at the same time, there's a goal that you're striving for.
That's true.
Okay, so you're kind of reaching for something, kind of reaching for the stars, so to speak. All right, we're going to do a special kind of reading. We're going to do something really quick rather than kind of laying out a full reading. So what I'm going to do is something I call the 3 + 1. 3 is a very mystical number. You are the 1. 4 piles, 4 decks, 3 + 1. pick up the last pile here. We're going to go from right to left. And take 3 off the top. Place them on the bottom of the same pile. The same, put them, all right, yeah. No, actually take 3 off the top, put them on the bottom of the same pile, and then just rotate, in other words, put them right down here.
Okay.
And then from the top of that pile, deal 1 card in each of the other piles in any order. Let's see what kind of luck you've got here. Put your cards down. Let's do the next pile. Take 3 off the top. Put them on the bottom and deal 1 off, again, in any order.
Okay, and you want me to?
Yeah, including that pile, right. See, there's that meticulous, strong-willed ordering going on. Take the next pile, do the same thing, 3 off the top.
Okay.
Put them on the bottom. Oh, same thing, and deal 1 out in each pile. 3 down, 1 in the hand. That's the 3 plus 1, and the last pile. Okay, now, turn over the top card in that same pile that you just finished up with. The sun. Reaching for a star. A goal, the sun in the sky. Take over the next card. Now, didn't I say that he had an inner strength to him? Turn over the next one. In fact, there is the star that he was reaching for. And the last card? A lucky man, the wheel of fortune. Now, in this case, I sense your strength with the strength of inner will, and I see that you're reaching actually for 2 goals, it looks like.
Okay.
Very strong. Would you please open the box there? Let's take out the card that's in there. It's stuck to the top, so peel it off. Let me just hand it to them. Actually, I want you to read it first. You can read it to yourself. Just make sure that we're going to be read the same way. Okay? And go ahead and read what it says out loud to everybody.
With good judgment and strength of will, along with a lucky spin of the wheel of fortune, you too will be a star.
Thank you, and thank you very much for
Thank
helping
you.
out. Perception is an interesting thing, and dealing with mystical symbols actually makes things even more interesting in some respects. When one goes into cases, and what I just did was, in effect, an effect. Part of the context for this workshop, of course, is that you're expecting that kind of thing. If I had done this in a different setting, this would have been a very differently perceived situation. Now, the rope trick would have been perceived as a magic trick no matter what, except in some cultures around the world. Or some people. I run into several people who just kind of like look at something like this and they run away thinking, "I hear the devil!" Very interesting. People think of magic that way sometimes. Thanks. But the whole idea is that we as investigators must do one thing very important, and that is, unlike what I advise people to go see a magic show, I advise them not to ask how it's done, because no one's going to tell you, except your friends who are usually going to be wrong. The whole idea is to be entertained. When we go into a case, we have to know how it's done. But we're not asking for fraud this time. We have to know how the perception of that apparition was done. Was that done through a misinterpretation of something in the environment? Or was that done because the person actually saw or perceived a figure, a person, an entity? Did that object move across the room, really, or did you see it just drop? That's important. You know, in poltergeist cases, we have one issue, and that is physical object movement. And here's the biggest problem. If someone in your family is faking you out or trying to fake you out, it's not that difficult. And people say, how is that possible? Well, the answer is, if you're already predisposed to thinking of something, and usually after a good scary movie or a good situation, or if you're stressed out, you're actually more likely to perceive things this way. One easy way, and okay, you can try this at home with your family, everybody. is if you kind of grab something off, preferably something non-breakable, okay, off of a shelf, let's say, and if it's something small preferably, and just kind of hide it behind your back as you're walking along in the room. Make sure that they're not looking. Very simple to do. You don't have to distract them. Just kind of like that. Keep your hand back. Toss it, in other words, in an arc from behind your head, so it kind of looks like it's coming from the ceiling. And it's actually sometimes better if it bounces off the ceiling. Something dropping in front of somebody or near somebody, if they're predisposed to thinking that this is a ghostly occurrence, they will think that it is a ghostly occurrence. So I don't want to teach everybody how to fake out your relatives. That's not what this whole thing's about, okay? We're talking here about, as an investigator, you must consider that in any case, it is possible that the fraud is directed at another family member, because the same thing that might stress a person out to make them subconsciously cause objects to move directed at someone else or directed at the environment would easily allow for the psychological dynamic for you to do that on purpose. Okay, so it's important to consider that. And I'll tell you about a case involving fraud in the poltergeist a little bit later. It's really important to consider all possibilities. And that's not to say you have to be a disbelieving skeptic. That's to say you have to be an open-minded skeptic. That explanations are sometimes psychic, sometimes not, and sometimes both. Okay, Annette, come on up. Talk about the intuitive skills a little bit that you employ.
Yes. I don't think I can do any magic tricks like this, but what I would like to explain to you is what it's like to be a psychic ghostbuster and what actually I do when I'm going into a case. I'm going to start at my home. What I do there, the very first thing that I do is I put on my cross, which you can see here around my neck. That's the very first thing that I do before I go out on a case. And I then will sit down and I will take in 3 deep breaths by bringing in white light in through the top of my head to kind of clear myself before I even get into my car. Then I will drive to either the hotel, the restaurant, or the home, to wherever we're going, to see if they have a ghost or if they have an impression or PK, whatever is going on at that particular place. Before I go into the building in my car again, I will close my eyes and I will open my hands, my palms up, and I will bring in the white light through the top of my head, through the frontal lobe or the crown chakra, and I will take in my 3 deep breaths. Now, what I'm doing here is that I am actually quieting my conscious mind. Our conscious mind, you know, is always going blah, 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 all blah, 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 all the time. And there is a way to quiet it down. And we can do this simply by taking in 3 deep breaths and focusing on something else. And what I have found throughout the years is that by using white light, which is pure positive energy, seems to be the best process in the world that I have found, and I've taught thousands of people how to do this. So by bringing in the white light, what it does, it clears out my conscious mind, and it stops all this yak, yak, yak going on all the time, thus allowing my subconscious, unconscious mind to become very active. I will get out of the car and I'll walk in, well, let's say I'm walking into the hotel restaurant. And I don't like to talk to a lot of people once I get at the place, because what I want to do is I want to go around and I want to kind of feel my way around. So what I'll do is I'll go out and I'll start putting my hands out like so and around me and just kind of get a feel for the place just to see if I'm going to be picking up any energies. Now the energies come across this way. So they're in waves, so that I will be able to feel those waves hitting my hands, okay? And sometimes it even feels like a breeze coming by, and I go, oh, what's that? And then I'll move over here and get a better feel. And you will see me sometimes going like this, and sometimes I will even feel a shape, if this is a ghost, or if there is some kind of an impression there. I can also feel the wall of where the impression is located. So I will go and I will walk around and I will see what I'm beginning to pick up. Now, generally what happens, we have already investigated. We know that there is something there. So say we know that there is a ghost there. Sometimes, as I spoke to you before, I don't even have to put my hands up because I can walk into the room like I did at the Brookdale Lodge, and voila, there she was, this little girl dancing around in a circle. So I didn't have to do anything. That's a lot of fun when I don't have to do that. I didn't have to look for anybody. There she was. But I did later on start using my hands to feel and see what other kinds of senses I would pick up. Now, in some other cases, what I have noticed, and this is kind of digressing a little bit, but when I'm using my hands out here, when I'm looking for a missing person and there's a dead body, what actually happens is that beads of sweat will appear on the palms of my hands. I mean, this absolutely freaks the cops out. I mean, they just go, whoa, look at that. And this has happened time and time and time again. It's a very, very interesting phenomena. And I feel that when that occurs, then I know that there was a dead body there, or there is a dead body there. When the dead body is actually there, I become very cold. When it had been there before, the cops had already found the dead body, then I will not feel this cold type of sensation. So it is very, very interesting. When I'm doing a ghost busting, I will also go and look for cold spots. And this is very, very important, because what I have found throughout the years is that the ghosts come in a certain area and they go out. They don't always stay within the same room or the same building. And they will go out and they choose one place. Now, I found that very, very fascinating, and I sat down and I said to myself, now, why is that? Why are they only going in one place and in and out in this one place as a doorway? Well, the only logical conclusion I came to was that it was familiar. And so once they came in one way, then it was very familiar to go out the same way. And so then every time they came in, they would just go and come in the same way. So it's like a doorway. And what we have found in some of the investigations that Loyd and I have done is that in these doorways that I have found that are extremely cold, we get a lot of readings with his...
Yeah, let me add a couple things here as you're going through. First of all, the readings are fairly clearly there. The cold is not always often a physical cold.
Yes.
That's one thing. When people talk about cold spots, there is the perception of cold, but there may not be a physical cold. Just like you can feel hot and not have a physical heat. So perception is not just seeing and hearing, and it's often feeling. It's often
Right.
smelling.
And I am feeling the cold, but you don't necessarily
Right.
feel the
So
cold.
if we put a thermometer or some other mechanism there, nothing's there. Nothing's going to
Right.
happen.
Right. So the sensing is coming through my hands and through the energy that I am perceiving. And so for me, the clue is that, uh-oh, this is cold, there's something happening here. And then immediately I will tune in to that area and see that that is definitely a doorway for them to come in and out, which is very, very interesting in itself. And I'd like to tell you a fascinating story about a particular ghost back east. I was sent, back east, this was probably in the middle, no, I think it was the late 70s. And I was doing a workshop back there, and I was doing readings, and I was asked to stay at this couple's home. And I thought, well, that's very nice. Okay, so I did. And they brought me in, and we had dinner. And then I went to my room, and they went to their room. I got into bed. Here I am again in bed again. Okay. and I pull the covers over, and I turn over, and I close my eyes. And suddenly, I opened my eyes because I felt a presence in the room. Well, I opened my eyes and looked at the bottom of the bed, and there is standing a Spanish soldier in full armor. And he's walking towards me, and I'm going, "Ah!" And I screamed because I was so taken back. You know, that I didn't know if he was real or a ghost or what.
This is a job for the sexorcist.
Definitely. Well, the couple came, it's like they came immediately, rushing into the room, opened the door and said, "Oh my God, you saw him." And I'm going, "How did you know?" Well, I put on my robe and we went out into the kitchen, and I sat them down and I said, "All right, now you have to tell me what is going on here. I'm going to tell you what I saw." And the lady is sitting there and tears are coming down her face. "Oh, Annette," she said, "we just didn't want to tell you because we didn't know if he would want to talk to you or not." I said, "I see." Well, obviously he did. And so what had been occurring in this house for over 10 years, this soldier was marching around. He would go into the lady's bedroom, open up the closet doors, and walk around with her slips. Her slips would be floating around the room. Her nighties the next day would be floating around the room. Her shoes would be walking across the room. Now, they put up with him for 10 years, can you imagine? But she said, just before we knew you were coming out, he started wearing my bras. And I said, "That's it."
He needed a good therapist is what he needed.
Yes. So they said, "We're going to have Annette Martin stay overnight here, and then maybe she can help us out." So they had just had it up to here with him because he was just getting too silly, they thought. And so she said, "Annette, you know, we just can't handle it anymore. We've had him for 10 years. We just can't handle it. Can you do something about it?" And I said, "Well, yes, I certainly can." And so I walked around the house, and I definitely found the cold spot. It was in the dining room, in the corner, and she says to me, "You know, every time I go to clean over in that area, I'm always backing up, and I don't know why." And I said, "Well, it's because this is the entrance and the exit." Anyway, what I did was I performed a ceremony. And what I do is I will sit down and go into meditative state, again taking in my 3 deep breaths with my white light, and I will talk to the ghost, tell them who I am, and I will ask the ghost why they're here, how long they've been there, why are they staying? Is there a reason why you're staying here? Is there a reason why you can't go on? And generally I will get an answer, always. And he told me that he had been killed there on the property and that he didn't know where to go. He was lost. So he decided just to hang around, and he thought they were a nice couple, and he just started, "I'm just having a little fun," you know. It was really very cute. And of course, all this time I was talking out loud so that they could participate and knew what was happening and what was going on. And so I asked him if he would like to leave and if he would like to go into the light, that there were some other relatives there waiting for him. And he said yes, he would. And so I said, fine. And so what I did is, again, I took in a lot of my white light through my breathing process. And what I do is I focus on the ghost. He had given me his first name. His first name was John. And I said, "All right, John, are you ready?" And I said, "I'm going to put you on this white light, and then you're going to move into the light." And I did that 3 times, and he was gone. And it was so interesting because the wife said, "Oh, it feels different." I mean, she felt it right away. And so I said, "Okay, now let me know. Call me," because I was leaving in a couple of days to go back to California. And I said, "Let me know if you have any more problems or, it's not working." They called me and they said, "He's gone. He's gone. The clothes aren't going around the house anymore and nothing is happening. He's gone." So that is how I deal with having a ghost move out. And I think it's very important to know how to do that and to be able to speak to them, ask them who they are, why they're there, and why they haven't left. Okay? Yes?
Have you, if doing these ceremonies and helping them leave, have you ever run into a family that called you in and decides, "We want him back, we miss him"?
No, I haven't. No.
You have to, in any situation, you have to counsel the family.
Yeah, but I'm just curious.
No, they've never
I've
asked
met
for him
people
back.
who want a ghost.
Oh, lots of people want them. Oh, yes. They've
Helps
said.
real estate in England.
Oh, absolutely. Helps restaurants and hotels. Yes.
I have two questions. One, have you ever noticed, because when I just been doing this for 2 years, and again, I don't know if it's perception or not, but I noticed there's some physical side effects that occur to me at a haunted place. The first one is dry mouth. First place I driving home, I thought.
Let me address that a little bit, because Annette was just talking about beads of sweat. I, over the years, have learned to pay attention to my gut feelings and other reactions that I get. And I've learned that you have beads of sweat. I've talked to other people who have dry mouth. Actually, I get that every once in a while. For me, I get a sinus pressure. Okay, I also was on a case in Oakland. It was a place called Holmes Books, which is no longer there. An old bookstore, long-term haunting. And I had a reporter with me who was just curious to see. He wasn't going to write a story. He just wanted to come along on an investigation. He was, as it happened, an investigative reporter. So he's just like on the crime beat a lot. And as I'm feeling the sinus pressure, he said, "Something weird here. My arm is like," it was his right arm, was really bothering me. And this was the same spot that we were getting high magnetic readings. Now, we went through other parts of the place, and every time I was getting the sinus pressure, he was getting this feeling in his right arm. So he was feeling, so he learned that this was a signal to him that something was going on.
Exactly.
And it's just that it's like our autonomic nervous system is somehow giving us different signals. Everybody perceives things differently. We have our own different interactions with the environment. We feel heat differently, we feel things differently, and to some people they might get beads of sweat, some people might get a terrible headache, some people might. I met one woman who, whenever the ghost would come in, as far as she felt into the room, she felt giddish, like she started giggling, like somebody was tickling her. Now, she would actually see the ghost. She didn't feel like somebody was physically tickling her, but it was like a tickle on her. So the people do experience these things differently, and the key is to recognize and to start out. Annette starts out setting herself up to experience this by doing her ritual. She does a ritual involving the cross, which is her ritual.
Right.
Okay. I'm Jewish. I probably wouldn't use a cross.
Right.
Okay. And does the white light piece, which is something that I've heard from other psychics, but I've also heard it from people who are practicing psychokinesis, from martial artists to try to draw in energy, kind of that kind of thing. Play with, center yourself with your chi.
Right.
Or if you watch Star Wars, it's tapping into the Force at that point.
That's what it is.
So there are things you can do to tell yourself to open up. That's the important thing, is giving yourself permission to experience this. And you can be both an intellectual observer and a psychic observer, intuitive observer at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. And just what Loyd was talking about is the same way that I teach people how to develop their intuition. It's exactly the same kind of process. And what I always tell my students is that look for the indicators. A lot of the gentlemen will get a feeling right here. They'll
That's
say,
that
well,
gut
I get
feeling.
that gut feeling right. Exactly.
That's programming too. I think that
yes.
I think that we are culturally
Definitely.
programmed. Women have intuition, men have gut feelings.
Right.
So where are men going to feel it?
Right here.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where they generally
Of course, the
feel
bigger
it.
the gut.
And sometimes people feel kind of a queasy butterflies in their stomachs, or they'll break out in a sweat, or they'll get really hot. Everybody has these different indicators, and so what you have to learn how to do is to pay attention to what your indicators are.
And this is a good lead-in to this next piece, which is equipment, because what's the best indicator? Human beings. You can
Well, I
use.
have a second question.
Okay.
If you go to a place where there's animals or pets, or like the resident cat at the hotel.
Yes.
Have you ever followed an animal around and see areas where they won't go or will go, or watch a cat and see if it's watching something?
I haven't necessarily watched the animals, but I do talk to the animals. And so the animals will tell me what's going on, what's happening. I do a lot of medical diagnosing on animals as well as human beings. And they will come. If there's an animal at the residence or the hotel or restaurant, they will come and tell me that something is happening. Go over here and look at this.
There's one thing about animals that's important, though, is not that the average person in home, having heard that cats and dogs react to this phenomenon, will often read in too much into it.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, anybody who has a pet knows, cats especially, will see things that the rest of us don't see, like insects and things, and will act really weird, and I personally don't think it has anything to do with the paranormal at all.
I have one thing I would like to put in, though. We have a dog, and Scott, my son here, can attest to it. We had a dog named Snoopy, little dachshund. And when we were living in Los Altos Hills, my office was in our home because it was quite large, and Snoopy insisted on sitting in between my feet. Do you remember, Scott, when I did my readings? I mean, she absolutely insisted. So I just let her sit there, and my clients thought it was fun and it was great. Well, whatever Grandma came in who had departed, or Grandpa, or a relative, or someone else came into the room, she knew before I saw them. And she'd look up like this, and she'd start looking around the room like this, and her ears would go up, and she was responding probably 2 seconds before I got it. It was very interesting.
An interesting correlation, too, because the best thing you can do in these cases is take multiple detectors, whether they are people or equipment, and correlate the experiences.
Right.
At the same time, there was a case I did, one of my first cases, in fact, the family claimed that the dog, their little dog, would not go up the stairs because of the ghost that was appearing up the stairs. It didn't matter if people sensed anything. It didn't matter if, they were upstairs and they felt the ghost. The dog just wouldn't go upstairs at all. And they clearly told me that most of the time there was no sensation of anything upstairs. Well, this dog was 14 years old, okay, which is fairly old for a little dog, and had arthritis. When the dog tried to go upstairs ahead of us as we were going upstairs to the area, the dog could not get up the stairs, and it had nothing to do with anything paranormal or psychic. And there was a sensation of something from upstairs, but it clearly was because the dog could not get up the stairs. In fact, I picked up the dog and carried the dog upstairs. The dog was perfectly happy to be upstairs. Didn't know, walked right through the area that everybody was picking up on something. So like, the woman was like,
It's not a psychic dog.
That's right. It's not a psychic dog, but the family thought it was reacting because of all the stories we hear. So you have to kind of play with both. And if you think the dog or cat is reacting, bring them into the middle of the phenomenon and see if they still react that way.
Exactly.
Push it a little bit, like you would push a person to do that.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, let's
Very
talk a little bit about equipment right now. Okay. The magic bag of tricks here, and then we'll take. First piece of equipment, a tape recorder. This is the Ghostbusters bag. All right. Why do you need this? Well, not because I'm expecting to get a ghost voice on tape. I need this because I want to tape the interviews I'm doing with the people, so I can go back over them later. And also, I want to make sure that if I pick up anything, it's not because they said something first. I want to check the timing of some things sometimes. It's good if you go to see a psychic like Annette to make a tape. And I'd always be suspicious of any psychic who says you can't tape it.
Right. I tape every reading.
Right. Now, if the psychic says tapes never come out, and you bring your own tape recorder and the tape doesn't come out, that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
That's different.
Or if you have a voice that appears on the tape that's
right,
not
and
yours
it's your
or the
tape recorder.
client's.
That's right.
That's happened too.
Right. And a microcassette works just as well. Just about anything works well. I also use for my own purposes, I have a couple different cameras. It's a regular camera using regular film. I typically use 400 or 200 film. I also take slide pictures. Thanks. I also take slide pictures because I want, for my purposes, for reference later, this is for purposes like this. But slide film has not ever shown anything to my knowledge. Photographic evidence is evidence. I mean, it is evidence. It's not proof, just like Annette's perceptions are not proof, not my magnetometer is not proof, but it's all corroborative evidence. In and of itself, the best detector is a human being, because we can interpret what we're getting. If you get a photograph, if you get magnetic field readings, if you get a number of other things with equipment, in and of themselves, you might be able to come up with a dozen different explanations for what could have caused that. When you corroborate that with people's perceptions, it makes a big difference. So, or even with other pieces of equipment. Polaroid cameras, interesting things. The film is developing as soon as you take the picture. So you have an in-process something that's happening. Problem with regular film is it exposes it, it stays there, that's it. You take it in for developing, it's developed. Any number of things can affect the film. Polaroid, there are very few things that will affect Polaroid film. Now, it's easy, it can be fake. You can fake things. You may have seen some segment on one of the TV shows where some guys were getting some writing on the pictures. That's not that difficult to fake. I can tell you that from a magician's standpoint. Getting a picture I take a great picture of Elvis holding a card that people have selected every once in a while in some of my psychic entertainment acts. But this is really good because if there's anything that affects film, anything in the environment, it'd be interesting to see what kind of effects you get. And we have on occasion got some very interesting what look like energy effects. And I had one piece that my colleague in Florida still has from one of the cases we did, which showed there are no point sources of light, just some real hot spots in midair. Now, this was taken at the exact same moment that we're getting very high magnetic readings, very high microwave readings, which is kind of a scary thing when you think about it. Our Geiger counter was going off. That was even scarier. We were also getting a number of other readings with thermograph film. So we had multiple things, plus people were sensing something. So all these things were going on. That was a real good piece of corroboration. Okay. The magnetic field detectors. This is a basic one. This is called a tri-field meter. It's one of the basic models. Now, it had been suggested to me to use this one because it measures more than one thing. It has two ranges of magnetic field, and it's frequency rated so it will not pick up people, because we give off a magnetic field as well. That's important that you don't kind of rate that. So,
It's the same as an EMF meter?
yes. Well, EMF means electromagnetic field. So one of the ranges that this picks up is electromagnetic field of a certain frequency range. Electric fields, which are put out by some things, I've never gotten a reading on electric field at all except near technology. Radio microwave, on occasion, usually near a microwave oven. Okay, so yes, I can use this to tell you if in fact your microwave is safe. This device is not designed for investigators. This is designed, well, maybe for environmental investigators. It's designed to tell whether there is environmental pollution in a household, to check for things like that. If it's because some things are considered to be possibly unhealthy, like electromagnetic field pollution. And actually everything in this range, magnetic, electric, and radio microwave, that's all part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So that's all part of the same, just different ranges in there. Now the other one I've got, and this one, by the way, is the one that correlates most often. It also is the one, it's always interesting when I got a TV crew following me around. They get too close, suddenly they all, it's spiking! It's spiking because the camera makes it spike. The producer says, you got to pick something up. You can show that it works. I said, get closer with the camera here. This is a fairly new one. This is called a natural EM meter, or a natural EM, and it makes sounds. He actually added a little sound to it. I talked to the guy who designed this. Same guy who designed the other from Alpha Labs. This will pick up different frequency range of magnetic and electrical fields, and will actually kind of allow for a combination of the two. And you notice that the more I move this around, the more sound it makes, because this particular meter has got to be stationary to work properly. It takes about 30 seconds to set. You really have to let it sit there. As you move it through, or a field moves through it, you can actually see the needle move. So once this is set in a specific place, you can actually leave it on and move it to someplace else, and 5 seconds later it's fine. And you get a slight reading from people. You can all hear that slightly. So this will read people, and if people stay away from it, and maybe picking up a field that's similar to people, and that might be an apparition. This will also, if the geomagnetic field locally goes, it'll pick that up too. So it's getting certain frequency ranges. And I'm working with somebody right now who's a physicist who's designed a device He's got a device now, he says, we'll be able to identify what specific frequency range we're getting with the tri-field meter. So we're trying to learn more and more, since this is the best correlation we've got so far. It's consistent. People's experiences over here, field over here. I had one case in which we literally were able to, with 2 tri-field meters, if the people say the ghost is in the room, she's moving through the room, they actually saw her, we were able to actually follow a floating magnetic field through a house in a really random pattern. She pointed, we picked up. So her perceptions were very clear, and something was moving through the house that had no physical explanation in terms of what we consider normal physics. Okay, other than that, there are other forms of EM meters. This is another sample cheapo Alpha Labs meter. It's not as sensitive. It'll pick up the same range, and it gives you little lights. None of them, unfortunately, work like a Star Trek tri-field meter, tricorder rather, although there is a company that has produced a licensed tricorder that does measure magnetic fields. It just still doesn't look like it does on TV, but they can still use it. They can use the tricorder name. And the other thing that I use most often, flashlight, to get into those dark corners. Now, infrared film. Infrared picks up heat, does not pick up anything but heat. So if the ghost gave off heat, you'd be fine. Or theoretically, if the room was hot and there was a cold spot, you could actually see that as a dark spot on the thing. You see a lot of old photos of infrared, but it seems like regular film, Polaroid actually seems to be the best in terms of consistently or more regularly picking things up. Infrared doesn't work. However, and I know, David, we're going to stop the tape here in a second, there is one other piece of equipment that we use, and I want to just show you a real quick clip of, and that's a thermograph camera that we have used on a few cases. It's very expensive. We either have to rent it with the help of perhaps TV companies. One of the reasons I work with TV companies is they get me to places that I wouldn't normally get to. And we have gotten some unusual things on the thermograph from time to time.
I feel there's a strong energy here.
At this point, we were using the thermograph camera, which registers heat patterns. It was during this part of the investigation that we noticed several unexplainable energy sources randomly appear on our camera. The energy sources appeared in the form of intense moving red clouds, or heat fogs.
It's fogging periodically.
No one, including the staff thermograph expert, could explain or duplicate the phenomenon under controlled conditions. These heat fogs seem to coincide with our magnetic readings, and existing data strongly suggest that hauntings have a direct correlation to magnetic energy fields.
Just some raw footage of us with Mrs. Gibo, the Japanese psychic, in a house in Archer, Florida. So you can see what thermal vision actually looks like real quick. So you can see thermal vision actually picks up, let me turn the sound down here. Thermal vision picks up a heat pattern, and you can vaguely see the outline of the back wall there, which has got some heat to it also. And what happens is, when we did pick things up, I'll tell you what we did. We got a red heat fog at a point where we were picking up things on a high magnetic field. Now, according to the manufacturer, Ajima, they said that you shouldn't pick anything up at all that's in midair, because unless there's a pocket of carbon dioxide gas, there's nothing else that can reflect. So you have to have a surface to put something out. So we got this heat fog. We also got, when Mrs. Gibo was talking to supposedly a little girl, where we were getting actually magnetic field and everything else going off, we got a nice blip of what looked like energy or heat energy in the center of that field. So it was kind of interesting. This is just Mrs. Gibo supposedly trying to talk to the ghost, and for the most part we got nothing. But on occasion, her hand got hot, her body got real hot when she said she was in connection with the ghost. So we could pick up also her response. And this type of device is often used in hospitals, check sinus cavities, things like that. It's also used by industrial folks to check for leaks in pipes, where there's hot water coming through. It's used in a number of other applications. It's not typically used for ghost busting. I will tell you one other thing that we did get with the thermal vision, and then we'll kind of close this little segment here. Very interesting. We were at a place called Ashley's in Archer, Florida. In Rockledge, Florida. This is a restaurant, another haunted restaurant. I mentioned it earlier. It's a place where the man was killed on the railroad tracks outside. The little girl was killed in front. We were getting all sorts of equipment going off. One thing I didn't mention, our thermal vision was picking up something that was very bizarre. And unfortunately, we do not have this on video for a reason I'll explain in a moment. This is what can happen in these cases. First of all, our Betacam batteries were not lasting more than 2 to 3 minutes in the place while we were actually getting the readings. However, when the cameraman would walk outside, the battery read full again, come back in, start looking like it was totally drained. And in fact, if we stayed in the place, they would drain themselves. We got on the thermal vision at one point, and if you just think of the setup this way, several of us are watching a monitor attached to the thermal vision. Guy working with the thermal vision is walking into the ladies' room, which is one of the center hot spots in the place. He suddenly yells, "Do you see that?" And on the monitor in color, we can see what looks like a hot cylindrical something, cylindrical, fairly well defined, floating in midair in the ladies' room. Regular camera's getting nothing at all. So I got 10 people, because we have a whole bunch of people from the restaurant watching this. This is very cool. We got a video recorder recording this also. This is the basic problem with equipment. Video is on. We had just put a fresh tape in because we had just interviewed Marty Caden. Just put a fresh tape in. Starting from scratch, unwrapped. 4 of us saw that. We did it. Okay, so we're watching this thing floating. We directed one of my associates to put her hand in the middle of the cylinder. She couldn't see anything. We figured, what the hell? So be careful if you ever work with me, I guess. So, and we told her that if she felt anything hot, because it read really hot. So she puts her hand and she said, it feels cool. I feel a cool area up here, and it feels staticky, like static electricity. And her hand kind of followed it along as it hit the wall and kind of merged and went out the wall. So we come back, they come rushing back in, we hit the rewind tape. Now this has been going for 3 to 4 minutes, maybe 5 at the most. It goes back, and it goes back, and it goes back, and it goes back. We're trying to figure out what's going on. This is a fresh tape. So we turn it on, and there is Marty Caden in the interview we'd just done. Now we put this tape away. The director, Jude, pulls out the tape that had Marty's interview on it. It says, tape 4, Marty Caden. Puts it back. We play it forward. No sign of any of the recording of the cylinder whatsoever. Okay, so we just left it there. We just said, all right, let's record again. Didn't take that tape out. We left it there. Let's try it again. We got nothing the second time. Well, let's at least look at the playback and see if we see anything in the playback that we can use later on. We hit rewind. We just figured we were only going to rewind a little bit to see if we got anything. It goes back, and it stops quickly. Guess what? It's a fresh tape. The only thing we had of footage on this tape was the stuff we had just shot. Marty Caden's interview is not on this tape that had not been taken out of the recorder. Tape number 4 is tape number 4. Somebody had been screwing around with either our minds or with the VTR, videotape recorder. Now that was a really weird situation, and fortunately, I mean, we had a lot of witnesses to what we saw, but we had no physical evidence. And to my knowledge, I don't know if anybody who's ever recorded anything like that. A couple of people I've talked to, one psychic said, well, it's the shape of this person's consciousness. I said, they're a cylinder? It's hard to say, but it's that kind of thing that you get, and the problem is that electrical equipment seems very open to being influenced, just like people are, and that is a problem. So you can't 100% rely on anything except yourself and the people you're working with as an investigator. To rely on equipment, we don't have a ghost detector, is a big mistake, because it will break down, your tape recorder will suddenly stop working, your camera will record nothing, okay, which won't help you. You will possibly pick things up, but certainly other people will. So when people ask me what's the best piece of equipment, I say it's usually a human being. And it's because of that very reason. The other thing is this tri-field meter has not broken down on me. It's run out of battery. You know, I've had to replace it, but I've been able to get correlations. It's a pretty simple device. The simpler it is, the less likely it is to be broken down. So there may be something to say about not having a tricorder that can have more problems develop with it. So keep in mind that there are a number of different options you've got, but your best piece of equipment is yourself. Okay, now we're going to move on to another segment in a minute. We'll take some questions here in a second. I want to mention that we're going to move on just to kind of a discussion of apparitions, poltergeists, and hauntings, and kind of how to deal with those things. Then we'll head up into our role plays and finish up.
Since you're talking about things following up the equipment and stuff like that, and I realize maybe this is more TV and stuff, if you run into anything like demons?
Okay. Demented ghosts, perhaps. I think the closest to a demon I could ever say would be that ghosts that had really bad self-esteem that I talked about before. The whole idea of demons in different cultures mean different things and are different things in different cultures. And that's a very culture-specific situation. That does not mean that, you know, you wouldn't, we've had cases where people have in fact reported seeing the horned devilish type of demon. But what's been interesting is that one of my colleagues had something similar, like a devil or a demon show up. She, after checking really closely in the case, it turned out to be a poltergeist case in which the person who was under the stress was not only moving objects, but causing a projection of his fears. Now, I had a case in which a projection was of a black knight, a knight in black armor, who, to my knowledge, had never walked around California ever before, except maybe in a Halloween party. And this was another poltergeist case where, in fact, there was a projection. She was imagining this black, evil, archetypal figure as causing all the events happening. And people around her were picking up on her self-illusion, you might say. So that's where the demons come from within ourselves. The monsters from the id, as they would say in Forbidden Planet.
Right, that's been my experience as well, as in working with clients, is that it's their own perception of what's going on with them, and so they are projecting and creating things to move, and so they foresee it as being evil. In actuality, it's themselves that they're projecting out there.
Yeah.
It's their own problem. And so those are the people that I have come into the office, and I do the psychic reading and I counsel them, and then a lot of the times I will send those people to a therapist, most of the time.
What's interesting is that very often the demons, think about all the demons that people have drawn and reported over the years, and think about what people dream about. The demons are very much, you know, people will say demons get into your dreams, but it may very well be the other way around.
Oh yes, it's the dark side of you.
Have you ever had an experience where you were at a place, investigating a place, and you felt you could not... Have you ever had an experience where you were investigating a place and felt you could not physically go into that room? That happened to me at Alcatraz. I was on the C cell, and I was going to take a picture in one of the isolation rooms. I got about to the cell door about as close as you, and I had to yank off the audio tape, and my throat closed up. I found myself against... Maybe, or something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I would say you were overstimulated and your own fears got in the way of you moving forward.
You know, some people have a hard time being in a place where there's a lot of visual input, and some people really have a hard time being in a room where there's nothing.
If you can really keep in your mind that in those places like Alcatraz or places where atrocities have occurred, that those are impressions that have been left there, okay? They cannot harm you, as a ghost cannot harm you as well. But the impressions are a very stationary kind of thing, and so that if you can get beyond your own fear, then you can go and see what is there, what happened. Be the observer. That's what I do when I'm working on murder cases. I'm not only the victim, I'm the assailant, but I'm also the observer. When it gets too hard and too tough and too scary, I move to the observer. And it happens very quickly. And so when you're going out and investigating a case, I would definitely do that. Be the observer and say, okay, I'm just looking at this.
And that's, again, what we try to get people in their own cases to do. Be an investigator, be an observer, and fear drops out of the equation pretty quickly. But sometimes, there are going to be times that, you know, you walk into a room where there's a stench. Physically, you sometimes can't be there, right? Sometimes you walk into a room where somebody's making the sound of, you know, a nail scratching on a blackboard. You know, you can't be there. So there's going to be certain perceptions that you get that are going to strike you the wrong way. And it may be that it's, you know, not going to bother anybody else. Anything else?
Is there any products in development right now that might assist in being able to prove it to the quote-unquote scientific community?
Well, I think that there is technology out there that we could that exists right now that would help us determine whether there are environmental factors. I think there's a lot of environmental sensing equipment that I'd love to get my hands on. It would be great to have some sort of portable geomagnetic sensor that's, you know, that's good, to see if there's any real local, really local measurements in the magnetic field that we know affects people.
Right.
As far as the ghost piece of it, there's one basic problem. We have no technology that detects the human mind in the body. Until we have that kind of technology capability, I don't think there's anything that's going to affect, you know, we're going to have that takes us into the field that will be able to detect that. You know, at least we know it's here. Finding it where it's floating around is a whole different issue.
Exactly.
And then the poltergeist thing, we have to determine whether or not there's an energy involved that moves objects. I mean, it just really depends on the case. But I think the environmental sensing equipment, because we were looking for things in the environment, and they will probably have some sort of physical correlate. We may not be at the right range yet, or sensitivity with our devices, our detection gear, but I think that there are things that we can use now if we could get our dirty little hands on them.
Right. Thank you.
As far as the impressions go, what did... As far as the impressions go, what determines why or what impression would be left?
I don't think there's any hard and fast rule on that. Sometimes they're very joyous occasions, like all the 25 people having a grand time, having the party that they're having at the Brookdale Lodge. Other times it could be a very traumatic event, okay, such as in a murder case, it could be a very traumatic.
I'll add to that, and that is that the psychic impressions that people get, and between living people perhaps, or even in clairvoyant experiences or precognitive, high emotion. The more emotionality there is, and this has been clear in the laboratory as well, the more emotional the content of the message or target, the more likely it is to get across. Therefore, the more emotional the content of the event, the more likely it is to be recorded or at least to be perceived down the road. Now, theoretically, you could pick up from day one of a location, but the louder signals are the ones that you're going to perceive.
So, for instance, that couple that lives in New York.
That was a pretty loud impression.
But they don't know themselves, right? They don't know themselves they left an impression.
They wouldn't know that they left an impression.
Right.
No. They wouldn't know
So
that.
they probably would be horrified to know that they left that impression. I thought about calling them actually for that very reason, but...
But we're leaving impressions all the time, okay? Whenever you touch anything, you're putting a fingerprint.
Right.
All right? You can't see that, but when the cops come along, they put the little powder on there, voila, there it is, okay? So we are leaving
We're also leaving skin flakes all over the place.
Right. But it's like Loyd said, and that I was saying, is it has to be a very exciting, high energy, emotional experience that went on there for it to stick.
And to be noticed.
And to stay, and for it to be noticed by a psychic or a sensitive or someone who's
Or the
living
average
in the
person.
house. Yeah.
So then, depending on the energy of the impression, would be determined to the length that
Possibly.
the impression would stay.
How long, it may depend on what came after that event, too. Whether there's something more
Overrode
emotional
it.
that recorded over it.
In murder cases, it goes on and on and on and on. So I will see the impression that is there, and I will see from the beginning of what happened with that person before they even got to the scenario of the murder scene. I will see the whole murder scene. I will hear conversations. I will smell. I will taste. I will know everything. It'll be like I'm in a movie. I'm right in it. Okay, I become the victim within that impression. I will also become the assailant at times and know how he feels, what's going on with him, if he has any medical problems, what the police can look for. And then I will sometimes step back and look and be the observer, especially at the point of the death. And then I will step back and become the observer. And so that impression, sometimes, my gosh, I mean, I've gone on sometimes for 4 hours. That's a long time without a break.
And sometimes it's, you have to remember these impressions are not always that easy to define. Sometimes you walk into a place and you get a bad feeling or a good feeling.
Yes.
And they
Just like
sometimes
a
pan
human
out.
being,
And it could be that the couple whose house you're walking into just had a big fight.
Yes.
And you can sense that.
Right.
So it's real interesting. We leave impressions behind. Of course, it's the bad ones that we really notice. The good things, I'm feeling pretty good right now. Yeah.
Because it's different.
Yeah.
See, the bad impression is different. It kind of gives you this kind of a sense, okay, and you kind of pick that up. You don't have to be intuitive at all. You can just kind of pick that up and you know that something is going on.
Okay, we have one more question here, and then we'll just take
One of those ghosts you were describing, like Anna Maria, who's been hanging around here for 400 years,
Yes.
and the Spanish one in Florida. Why do you think they get stuck there on that plane as a ghost? I mean, why don't another spirit or a spirit guide or something come and tell them what's going on or help
Well,
them?
that's a very good question. I don't know why a relative hasn't come down to help them. That I don't know why. But all I know is that their willingness to leave is not there, and they feel kind of entrapped. It's the little girl down at the Brookdale Lodge. She's waiting for her mother. Okay. Anna Maria here is waiting for her Russian sailor to come and get her. And they're afraid to move into the light. The Blue Lady at the Moss Beach Distillery is afraid, most definitely, to leave because her husband is on the other side. And man, she's not going there. He killed her. So she's not going anywhere.
And that story, which has to do with a lover's triangle, you might say. Her boyfriend, the piano player at the Moss Beach Distillery back when she was alive, may in fact still be alive. You know, he would be in his 90s now. We don't know exactly who he is because the records of that era, because of the gangland involvement, the organized crime involvement, very difficult to deal with. But he may be alive, and if she's waiting for him, she's maybe waiting for him to show up because he's got to die first. The bartender owner, Tony Gukin, at the Banta Inn, is clearly hanging around the restaurant because he loved the place when he was alive. He loves the place now, and unless the clientele changes and the place gets blasted down, he's going to stay there and have a good time. So if he's stuck, he's perfectly happy to be stuck.
Yeah.
And then I also had a case in which we asked through a young boy who was talking to the ghost, we asked, why are you here? Why did you come back? Why didn't you go on to wherever? She said she'd been fairly wealthy when she was alive. She didn't go to church every week, had a lot of parties, didn't know if she'd end up in heaven or hell, so figured, why take a chance? This is coming from a 12-year-old boy, and I thought this is like the best answer I've ever heard from anything. And that's very normal human psychology.
Yes.
So we may stick around purely because of intent, but there probably are other factors involved. I tend to believe that it's more than just that there may in fact be environmental factors that even allow you to stay around. You know, it may just be that there's some other factors that are going on in the environment that allow an individual to say, hey, I want to stay here, or hey, I'm scared to go anywhere. Because otherwise we'd have a lot more ghosts running around.
Oh, yes.
So there's something else. Okay, we're going to move on to our next module, which has more to do specifically with apparitions, poltergeists, and hauntings, how to deal with each of those types of cases, and how to resolve each of those types of cases. From there, we'll move on to role plays, and from there, we'll close out. That's it for our second module on basic investigation techniques. Hope you've understood quite a bit of the basics that people do need, the skills that you need to become a paranormal investigator. On our next tape, we'll deal with the basic phenomena that one might encounter when you're talking about our big three, what I like to call the big three of parapsychology: apparitions, hauntings, and poltergeists. What are these things? How do you look at them individually and together when they get mixed up in a case? What are the theories behind them? And what are the resolutions that one needs to come to with the families that you work with?